Here begins the second part of my Pencast conversation with Ana Hinojosa, formerly Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and now head of ABH Global Trade Consulting.
So after 5 years on the front lines in El Paso, you moved to Washington, D.C. to become Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Office of International Affairs. So another complete pivot, another complete change in your career trajectory. What was that like?
That was really, that was a lot of fun, very interesting. And I found it to be something that really fit my personality, really fit my, kind of my, I don't know what you call it. Prior to going to DC, I had already been working on a couple of bilateral relationships. I'd been asked to kind of lead the U.S.-Mexico bilateral work, as far as keeping track of the work plan and what everybody was doing in that area. And then I was also doing that for the U.S.-Canada relationship on the Beyond the Border initiative. And so that kind of had piqued my interest. And so that's one of the things that drove me to go to D.C. to do that more formally. While I was in this role, I was able to renegotiate, lead the renegotiation of the U.S.-Canada pre-clearance agreement, which was quite the labor of love, I guess I'll call it, because, Canadians and most, I'm going to say most crown countries are not very gun friendly. Everybody knows the U.S. is a little bit more free with its weapon, with our gun policies. But in this case, the reality of terrorism, the reality of drug smuggling, et cetera, is something that our officers face, as I explained to you earlier, on a regular basis, and the need to have the right tools to do their job was really important. And so in the renegotiation of the pre-clearance agreement, we were able to, over a long period of time, negotiate the ability for our officers to actually carry their weapons in Canada, which was a huge feat, because that was one of the bright lines that Canada didn't want to agree to. And I also got to travel to a lot of countries. It was my first experience traveling to Africa.
Oh, wow.
And that was also eye-opening, and I don't know, it was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I had the chance to travel to Morocco, and I traveled to Ghana, and it was just really a great experience. Since then, with my next job, I got a chance to travel all over the world. But again, I think it's a good fit for me because I love people, and I love to learn about their culture, and I love to learn about their food and the significance of what's important to them. And so I'm an extrovert, so I love to talk to people and learn from them, and people like people who are interested in them. So, I feel like I was able to get along very well with people.
And you yourself are bicultural, right? And so, you're
Right.
kind of discovering this world. And probably after your experiences in LA and in El Paso, you were ready to explore a broader horizon, maybe decompress a little bit, or at least face different challenges.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your next job, and so we'll transition to, that's the World Customs Organization, right? As a director of compliance and facilitation. So you're really going to the wider world.
Yes, I was the only woman in an elected post at the World Customs Organization. When the post opened, three candidates kind of applied for the post. There was a gentleman from Germany, a gentleman from France, and myself from the United States. There were two other posts that were open as well, all men competitors in all of those roles. So I was the only female candidate for any of the roles. And I managed to be successful in gaining votes of the member countries for my role as the director for compliance and facilitation.
Well, that's where your experience is diplomatic in diplomatic roles and bilateral accords, and being a people person probably paid off.
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, the work of the World Customs Organization is really about helping bring standardization, harmonization, transparency in some regards, setting international standards, providing guidance and tools to the member countries on how to best address a particular issue, whether it's for facilitation purposes or for interdiction of illicit, cargo.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be somewhat of an extrovert. You have to be able to kind of herd cats to some extent. Every country has its own experience. And so it's important to be able to get people on the same page, get them to understand the differences, but really understand where there could be some harmonization, because ultimately everybody wins if everybody's speaking the same language. And there's something that in the customs world we talk about, which is called the customs family.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a very real thing. It's a very real thing that anywhere around the world, if you're a customs officer and you go to a customs area in another country, you are recognized as being part of the customs family. And it's not that you're not going to be subjected to inspection or anything like that, but there's an automatic respect and understanding of the world that we work in, because we all face a lot of the same things, especially as it relates to the cross-border movement of goods.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, a lot of my conversations, people in the customs world feel like they're, in a sense, they're being asked to do more every year, and more responsibilities, more challenges, more new problems to solve, and in many cases with less, with fewer resources, with fewer people. So I can see how there would be a sort of a sense of family, a sense of being in this together, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that feeling, honestly, is something that for the 35 years that I was in the government work, that was a feeling every year. Every year you felt like you were being asked to do more with no more resources, but you make it happen because it's a dynamic world and it's evolving, and stagnation is failure.
Mm-hmm. Stagnation is failure. That sounds like I need to get a tattoo with that. That's really good. That's really good. Yeah, and that's exactly the attitude to take. Now, coming from Customs and Border Protection within the Homeland Security, fairly integrated model, to World Customs Organization, which is probably in certain sense the opposite of integrated. How is that in terms of challenges for you to adapt to this new, very sort of diplomatic really role, rather than giving orders and receiving orders? You were kind of negotiating and convincing people. How was that?
Well, I found it to be, I had an adjustment period because I had been in charge for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even though I was in a leadership role, I wasn't in charge. I was,
Mm-hmm.
I was entrusted, I was entrusted with guiding, which was different than you're in charge and make it happen kind of thing. And I was in a learning mode because I hadn't been in the international organization space like some of my other colleagues had, where they'd worked at the WTO or they'd worked at other international organizations. So they kind of understood the flow of how things worked, and just kind of slow down. You're not going to get anything done, in the first month that you're here. But from the perspective of getting things done, I think I learned a lot about it isn't a hierarchy, and you have to understand everybody's perspective, because there is a real reason why they're coming forward with their perspective. There's an impact to their country. There's some real interest there. It's not like they're negotiating to get something better for their country. It's that they have a real concern or they have a different angle that they're having to address that in general, it doesn't happen in other countries. There is a big difference between the industrialized countries versus, some of the developing countries and what they can incorporate in some of the requirements. But there's also a real opportunity to leapfrog the development. So to the extent that the countries that are quote unquote developed countries have taken hundreds of years to get to where they are because of the fast pace of automation, because of the fast pace of availability of tools, there's a real opportunity to not have to, learn by going through all of the pains, but really leapfrog into a more modern situation. Obviously, money is always a factor. And a lot of the development work that is done by HMRC, GIZ, all of these different international development programs are make some amazing contributions to these developing countries to enable them to be able to do that leapfrogging, which ultimately pays off for the developed countries' private sector to be able to have an easier way of trading with those countries.
Yeah, and as you say, not having to reinvent the wheel, the possibility of going to school on hundreds of years of experience and actually moving ahead without making some of the errors that the developed countries have made is encouraging. That's a very positive take on things. I'm going to move on to your return to Washington, D.C. as none other than the executive director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Were you the first woman in this role too?
This particular role was in the Office of Trade. Most of my career, I had been in the Office of Field Operations. And so within Customs and Border Protection, there are, I'm going to say 6 operational offices or maybe 4 operational offices that handle different responsibilities. One of the largest ones is, and probably the most visible one, is the Office of Field Operations, which is the people in uniform all across the country that are greeting the cargo or the people as it's coming across the border. This assignment was within the Office of Trade, which, frankly, when you're serving in a senior executive level position, and I had left to the World Customs Organization and I had to leave the U.S. government, but I left with with guaranteed rights to return into my position. So not into my position, but into a senior executive level position. But the head of the agency gets to decide where they need you the most. And so while I was gone, the U.S. had changed some laws. And one of the areas that had been gaining quite a bit of attention was the issue of the prohibition against importation of goods produced with forced labor. That law changed in 2016. I returned back to the U.S. at the end of 2019, started back in January of 2020. And suddenly I'm the executive director in charge of overseeing, amongst other things, the implementation of that prohibition against the importation of goods produced with forced labor. There had been some work done in the couple of years before I arrived, but there was a great deal of frustration from the White House, from Congress, from the department, from even leadership in the agency, that they didn't feel like there was sufficient enforcement happening. The private sector, civil society organizations were up in arms because there had been a kind of an uphill battle to get the law changed. And now that the law was changed, they expected, that there would be some more enforcement taken, and it was slow coming. And so part of what I was asked to do was to make it happen. And so I was the executive director for Trade Remedy Law Enforcement, which is a terrible title, but that's really the role. And I had to basically look at what what was happening, what was working, what wasn't working, in a very quick time frame. And so this was January. I started January 1 to something like that of 2020. By early February, I was down in Malawi because we were looking at a ban that had gone into effect on the importation of all tobacco from Malawi. And so that was a really eye-opening experience to be in Malawi, to understand the forced labor situation there, and kind of the very difficult situation where these large companies have tenant farmers. These tenant farmers are indebted. They don't get decent living conditions. They end up having to put their children to work in this very dangerous planting, harvesting, and processing type of work. So it was a very real. It was very good to have that experience early on because it really cements in the fact that these are real people that are being impacted by this, and it's important to bring about change. And so I think that what the U.S. has been very aggressive in its implementation on the prohibition against the importation of goods. And I know that there's the EU has just passed their forced labor ban. I'm really excited to hear how that gets implemented. Canada also has their new legislation and good opportunities to start taking some action there. It's not perfect. I mean, I think some people would criticize, well, if you kind of are eliminating the opportunity for some of these people to work, is that really better for them? Maybe they would rather have a little bit of money than no money. And that's a whole other situation. It's a whole other issue that unfortunately we can't solve, world poverty from this, but neither should we condone indentured servitude to satisfy our, desire for consumer products. So there's a whole challenging issues with that. But so getting back, I had to deal with what was not working and re-engineer the work that we were doing, reassign some people that were not in the right place, organize some new collaborations. And because of my experience in the Office of Field Operations, I was able to use that to leverage better cooperation from that office than my predecessors had been able to, because they didn't speak the same language, because they didn't.
You've got to have a lot of credibility after your distinguished experience there, and people recognize you again as part of the customs family. They know you as one of their own. They're going to listen hard when you speak.
Right, and because it was such a high profile requirement and issue, I had access to the commissioner. I had access to the Secretary of Homeland Security. I had access to many people at the White House, because everybody was interested in making sure that we got this done right. And so a lot of hard work into that. I think the results speak for themselves. I think we had a record-setting year in 2020 and surpassed that in 21. As we were very humbled by the nomination by the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonprofit organization that recognizes every year public servants who are just government employees doing good things. And we're really humbled to be nominated by CBP for one of the categories, because I mean, some of the people that were nominated are just amazing people. I mean, some in different categories, people who come up with like a new vaccine that's going to help children with a particular medical issue. These are amazing people. And here we were, just trying to do the best that we could at our job with regards to forced labor. And we were nominated, and for our category, which was international trade and security, we won. our category, and then all of the top nominees have to go through a competition for what is called the People's Choice Award. And literally the people, like civilians, the public at large, gets to vote on who gets the People's Choice Award.
Wow.
And we won the People's Choice Award. So that was really very, very, like I said, humbling. And we tried to do justice to all of the people that are part of it, because forced labor enforcement is not something that happens just because one person is doing their job. It really takes a whole system, and the system was working well, and that's what brought about the results. We just happened to, you couldn't nominate everybody, so we just happened to be the faces that would put forward, but it was the teamwork that really won the award.
Well, I can see how an issue like that. I mean, your job title may have been a bit dry, Executive Director for Trade Remedy and Law Enforcement, but the realities are, as you said, we're dealing with real people here. And a month into your job, you're down in Malawi seeing what that looks like. If I'm right, in June of 2022, so 2 years after you started, 2.5 years after you started there, the U.S. modified the law of 2016 and created the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act as well, to cover products made in the Xinjiang region of China. That's clearly part of this, a central part of this effort as well.
Right. So the law was actually passed in December of 21, but they, unlike most laws in the U.S., this one had a deferred implementation period to June of 22. So the enforcement for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act kicked in June of 22, as you rightly stated, which was yet another big milestone in the sense that it gave a great deal of authority. By then, of course, I'm retired, so I'm not taking any credit for all the great work that my colleagues at CBP have done.
Well, you laid a lot of the groundwork, though, no question.
I would hope that I contributed a little bit for this, but I think one of the important things, because as you know, I've now, and now everybody knows, I've done some work internationally. And so I've had an opportunity to work with other countries, mostly in my regular career with Mexico and Canada, but obviously in my role in the WCO with all of the member countries of the WCO. But what I've learned is the laws may look the same, but the devil's in the details, and what the legislative framework is on how those laws can actually be implemented. And so, for example, the difference between enforcing for forced labor in the U.S. and enforcing for forced labor in Canada is different. And even though Canada Border Services has a lot of border authority, their authority with regards to forced labor is somewhat different. Well, it's very different than what the U.S. has. The U.S. has complete authority for enforcement. I'll call it that. It might be too much of an exaggeration, but kind of a more holistic approach towards investigation. The CBP has the responsibility to take in allegations, develop allegations, do investigations, to make determinations of whether or not there's forced labor, and then take the enforcement action. In Canada, there's a different department of the government, a different organization of the government that has the responsibility to conduct the investigations and then issue a report. And only then can Canada Border Services take action in response to the reports that are generated by this other department of the government. And this is going to be very similar to what the EU will be doing, in that they will have a separate body that will be conducting the investigations and making the determinations on whether or not there is forced labor in the production of those goods. And then that information or intelligence or whatever reporting emanates from that would go to the enforcement agencies, which would be the customs administrations from across Europe, right? And it seems like a really unwieldy thing, and I know that when I talked to some of our CBP officers in the field when we were first working on this, they would say, well, how am I going to know? How am I going to know? How, this is too much. I don't know anything about modern slavery. I don't know anything about forced labor. Why am I being asked to do this? I think the best advice I can give anybody in any customs administration is this is customs work. It's not unlike other customs work that we do with regards to, for example, the baby formula that was tainted with mercury, right, or lead. So we don't know about the lead content or this or that. We rely on experts to make those determinations. So similarly, the CBP officer in the US or in Canada will rely on an expert to have investigated whether or not there's forced labor. And then based on the results of that investigation, you will take enforcement action, just like you would if a sanitary agency tells you this baby formula from this country, from this manufacturer is a high risk of lead content or mercury content. Stop it at the border and don't let it enter our country because it's a risk and a hazard to our civilians. That's what we do at customs. We protect our citizens and the people in our country from hazardous people or goods. And that's, the hazards of goods produced with forced labor are many. I would say one of the biggest hazards is economic, because our domestic or maybe our lawful products that are brought into the country have to pay decent wages, have to pay, living conditions for the workers, have to pay fairly. Whereas people who are willing to subject people to forced labor are already not paying fairly and are already underpaying wages. And so we can't compete against those types of products. And it's a real economic disservice. But again, circling back to this is traditional customs work. Don't get mired into all of the fancy words or complications of it. For customs administrations, it's customs work. You'll be able to, it's basically a different prohibited product. And you just have to determine who makes the determination of prohibition. Sometimes it's the Food and Drug Agency. Sometimes it's the Agriculture Agency. In this case, it'll be whatever entity is deemed to be the investigative arm to determine that there's forced labor. And then based on that, you take your customs action.
This concludes the second part of my Pencast conversation with Ana Hinojosa, former Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and current head of ABH Global Trade Consulting. Tune in soon for the third and final segment of our talk. Thank you.